It was one of those perfect, crisp fall evenings, where the air carried just the right amount of chill to make you pull your jacket closer. My little apartment was alive with laughter and warmth as my friends gathered to celebrate my 21st birthday. I glanced around, feeling both lucky and out of place. After all, I was the only human in a town dominated by werewolves. But my eyes kept drifting to Liam, the beta of the Blue Ridge Pack and also my classmate. He stood by the window in my house to celebrate my birthday, but as always, he felt a million miles away. His piercing blue eyes distant, his arms crossed, the muscles ticking slightly. His brown hair fell slightly over his forehead, giving him a rugged look that I had loved for years. But he'd always been like that, distracted, untouchable. He never looked at me the way, and I knew why. I wasn't like him.
Come on, Mera, make a wish.
Jenny nudged me playfully, breaking my train of thought. Right, I said, shaking it off. I leaned forward, closing my eyes briefly. I made the same wish I'd made every year since I was 16. Let Liam see me the way I see him. The candles flickered out as I blew, and cheers erupted. I smiled as best as I could, cutting the cake and handing out slices. Everyone was laughing, joking around, but my mind was elsewhere. On Liam's silence, on the way he avoided looking at me for too long. As the party wound down and people started leaving, I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning up empty plates and cups.
Happy birthday, Mera.
I froze at the sound of his voice. Liam. Turning around, I found him standing there, hands shoved in his pockets. His brown hair fell messily over his forehead, making him look rugged and impossibly handsome. Thanks, I said softly, meeting his piercing gaze for a moment before looking away. He hesitated like he wanted to say more, but instead he sighed.
I should go. Stay safe, all right?
Yeah, I murmured, my chest tightening as he turned and walked to the door. He paused there for a second, his back to me, but he didn't look back. The door clicked shut, and I let out a shaky breath. I hated how much power he had over me, how my heart ached every time he pulled away. I started to tidy up again, but a knock at the door interrupted me. Frowning, I opened it to find a delivery boy holding a small package.
For you, Miss Mera,
he said with a polite smile. Confused, I took the package and thanked him. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a silver bracelet and a note. My breath caught as I unfolded it.
Happy birthday, Mera. Leonardo.
Leonardo, the alpha of the Blue Ridge Pack and my silent protector. I hadn't seen him in months, not since the day he saved me from a rogue wolf. Yet every time danger finds me, he's always there. Later that night, I stepped into the bed, memorizing today's wishes and laughter. The air shifted suddenly, the way it does before a storm. A low growl reached my ears. My stomach dropped. I caught something moving from the corner of my eye. I turned slowly to the window. Glowing yellow eyes stared back at me from the darkness. The window shattered before I could process everything. A massive wolf lunged at me, its claws raking my arm. Pain exploded in my body, sharp and unbearable. I screamed, kicking and struggling against its crushing weight. Suddenly, another presence burst inside. Within a second, the rogue wolf was thrown away from me like a rag doll against the floor. There he was, Leonardo. His dark brown hair loose and wild, his light brown eyes burning with fury. His broad shoulders and towering frame made him look like an avenging god. His muscles rippled under his black shirt as he shifted into his wolf form. He looked terrifying and powerful, his light brown eyes glowing with an intensity that could freeze anyone in their tracks. Within seconds, it was over. The rogue wolf lay lifeless, and Leonardo stood over it, his breathing heavy. "Leo!" I whispered, clutching my arm. He turned back to me, his form shifting seamlessly into human, leaving him completely bare in the dim light. For a brief, breathless moment, I caught a glimpse of him, his strong, muscular lines, raw and commanding. But before I could truly take it in, the pain surged through me like fire. The last thing I saw was Leo, his face etched with panic, rushing toward me, his arms stretched out, ready to catch me, to hold me close. But the world tilted. Darkness swept in, heavy and relentless, pulling me under before I could feel his embrace. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the scent of pine and earth. The bed beneath me was soft, and the room was dimly lit. I opened my eyes wide. It wasn't my apartment, it was some luxurious fortress. I groaned as I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my arm.
Don't move.
The deep voice was calm, but commanding. I turned my head to see Leo sitting in a chair beside me. His hair was tied back in a loose bun, and his sharp features were unreadable.
You were bitten.
He said, his voice low.
The transformation has begun.
I froze. What? No, I'm human. That's not possible. He leaned forward slightly, his light brown eyes meeting mine.
Not anymore. The venom has already started to work. You're going to need the pack now, Meera. It's the only way you'll survive.
My stomach turned. This couldn't be real. My life, my plans, everything, I couldn't lose it all. Not like this. Tears pricked my eyes. Why did this happen? Why me? Leonardo's hand twitched as if he wanted to reach for me, to brush the tears away, but he stopped himself. His fingers curled into a fist at his side, his jaw tightening as he held back.
It wasn't supposed to happen,
He said, his voice low but firm.
I asked you earlier to come into our pack for your own safety, but you didn't.
His eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of regret crossing his face.
But now, as you are here, I'll make sure you're safe. I promise.
It was true. He had asked me to join the pack for my safety. But I didn't listen. I thought I could handle it, living in a town full of werewolves, on my own. And now I am facing the consequences. There was something in his voice, something steady and unshakable, that made me believe him. For now, that would have to be enough. The night air was cool, wrapping itself around me like a soft blanket as I stepped onto the balcony. It had been 2 days since the bite, since my life as a human slipped through my fingers like sand. My senses were heightened sharp, like I could hear every rustling leaf and every distant murmur of wind in the trees. It was like my whole body was alive in a way I had never experienced, and I hated it. I stood there on the porch of the cabin, my hands gripping the railing, trying to steady myself.
Meera?
Leo's voice came from behind me, steady and calm, but with that undertone of authority I was learning to recognize. I turned slightly, catching a glimpse of him leaning casually against the doorway. His dark hair was damp, like he'd just come in from a run. He was wearing a black blazer paired with a fitted black shirt that clung to his broad chest, the fabric stretching slightly with each movement. I tilted my head, momentarily distracted by the thought. Did he change into his clothes at night? Or did he sleep in the blazer like some kind of nocturnal businessman?
How are you feeling?
His voice pulled me from my thoughts. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing softly against the wooden floor, and his eyes were sharp, fixed on me, studying me closely. I sighed, turning back to the sky. Everything so loud. That was the only way I could describe it. Leo came to stand beside me, his presence solid and grounding.
It's overwhelming at first. I remember that feeling.
I shot him a look. You? Overwhelmed? For a second, he just stood there, watching me with those sharp eyes of his, like he was measuring me. And then, he chuckled.
I wasn't always the calm, collected alpha you see now.
His words surprised me. I had never really thought of him as anything other than what he was now. Strong, confident, in control. But hearing him admit that, I don't know, it made me feel less alone in this chaos. Like maybe I could figure this out.
You're not the only one who's had to learn.
He added, his voice softer now. He was standing right beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, but not close enough to make me uncomfortable. His presence was grounding. Before I could let myself think about it, the sound of footsteps behind us caught my attention. I turned around, just as a woman stepped onto the porch. She stood before me like a storm, her presence commanding attention without a single word. She was tall, almost statuesque, with a posture so straight it was as if the world itself had been molded around her. She was strikingly beautiful, about 4 to 5 years older than me. Her sharp eyes calculating, sizing me up. She was dressed in a black jacket, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. I stood there, feeling myself shrink under her gaze. Leo started, his expression calm.
Meera, this is...
I will introduce myself to the famous Meera,
She said, her gaze flickering between Leo and me. I frowned, confused. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes.
the only human girl in the entire city. Everyone's talking about you.
She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the wood, and extended a hand toward me.
Caroline.
I shook her hand, giving her a polite smile, even though there was something in the way she looked at me that made my stomach twist. Meera, I said, still unsure of what to make of her. Leo stood behind me, quiet, but I could feel his eyes on us. Where's Liam? I asked, trying to ignore the tightening in my chest as I glanced at Leo. Liam was the beta of the same pack. I hadn't seen him since I arrived here, and the silence between us was growing louder. Caroline raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at her lips.
Oh, Liam! He's been sent out of the territory for an important meeting with other packs. Alpha Leo has a lot on his plate right now.
Her gaze lingered on Leo, but she quickly turned her attention back to me.
It'll be just you and Leo. He will be busy mentoring you for the next few days. So he sent Liam instead of himself, isn't it, Leo?
Leo caught my eye, his expression unreadable.
I need to train you, Meera, to help you control this.
He gestured to me, but it wasn't just a simple motion. It was the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on me, like he was seeing something more, something I wasn't yet ready to understand. Great, I said, the sarcasm dripping from my voice even though I was anything but ready. But the truth was, I needed him. I needed him more than I wanted to admit. Caroline stepped back, crossing her arms as she eyed me with something that almost resembled jealousy.
Well, if you need anything, Meera, I'm around. For now, I should leave.
Her gaze lingered on Leo for a moment before leaving. As she turned to leave, I couldn't help but notice the way Leo's eyes followed her just for a second too long. When she was gone, Leo turned back to me, his expression softer now.
We'll start tomorrow if you feel good, but for now, I think you could use a little rest.
He said, his voice low and steady. I nodded, unable to argue. My head was already spinning, and the last thing I wanted was to drown in my own thoughts. It was the first day of my training when a soft knock at the door broke the silence. Leo stood there, ready, the same calm intensity in his eyes that had become so familiar over the past few days. But as soon as I saw him, the words I'd been trying to ignore slipped out. It's too loud. He reached out, his hand brushing mine lightly. The contact was brief but grounding, like he knew exactly how far to go without pushing me.
Come with me.
He said. His eyes held mine, and despite my better judgment, or maybe because of it, I found myself nodding. As we walked through the house and out into the clearing behind the pack house. The grass was damp beneath my bare feet, and the cool morning air made my skin tingle.
Okay,
Leo said, standing a few feet away from me.
let's start simple. Close your eyes.
I raised an eyebrow. Is this some kind of wolf yoga? He smirked, a rare flash of amusement in his otherwise steady demeanor.
Close your eyes, Meera.
With a sigh, I did as he said.
Now focus. What do you hear?
At first it was chaos, the rustling of leaves, the distant howl of a wolf, the soft hum of insects. But as I concentrated, the sounds began to separate, each one distinct. The wind, I murmured, the trees creaking, someone laughing, far away.
Good.
His voice was calm, like a teacher encouraging a nervous student.
Now, what do you smell?
This one was harder. The sense of Leo's was filling my senses. I smell you, I said simply. When I opened my eyes, He stood close, his light brown eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made the air between us feel electric. For a second, the space between us seemed to shrink, but then he stepped back, clearing his throat.
You're doing well.
He said, his tone returning to its usual business-like quality. Yeah, sure. Smelling things is my new superpower, I muttered, trying to shake off the moment.
It's more than that.
He crouched down, picking up a smooth stone from the ground.
Your senses are your strength. They'll keep you alive.
I watched him, the way his strong hands turned the stone over thoughtfully. He made everything seem so easy, like this life was just another chapter. Do you ever miss it? I asked quietly. Being human? Leo looked at me, his gaze steady.
Sometimes, but being a wolf isn't a curse, Meera. It's a gift. You'll see that eventually.
As we trained, sweat slicking my brow, I caught a glimpse of Caroline standing on the balcony. Her gaze was fixed on us, her expression sharp and tense, jealousy written in every line of her face. But Leo didn't notice her at all. His attention was completely on me, his hands guiding mine, his voice steady and encouraging. Every movement, every word was for me, and the intensity of his focus made it impossible to look away. Back at the house, the warmth of the fire chased away the chill from outside. I sat cross-legged on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, while Leo leaned against the fireplace, his arms crossed.
Today your room will be renovated.
He said casually. But then his expression shifted.
Liam called.
He added, breaking the silence. My stomach flipped. What did he say?
He knows about the bite and he was happy about it.
Leo said with a smirk, but the flicker in his expression and the tension in his shoulders didn't escape me.
I wonder, how can he be happy?
I nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over me. Liam had always kept his distance, cautious, as if my humanity was a wall between us. Now that wall was gone, and yet I wasn't sure where we stood anymore. Leo's gaze lingered on me for a moment before he turned away, his voice softer.
Good night.
As the fire crackled softly in the background, I couldn't help but wonder how much more my life could change. The pull I felt toward Leo was undeniable, but Liam had always been there, steady and familiar. And me? I was caught in the middle, torn between who I was and who I was becoming. It had been a week since Leo started training me, and every day felt like I was walking on the edge of something unnamed. At first, it was overwhelming, the instincts, the pull of my wolf. But now, with Leo around, it felt like I could finally breathe. This morning, sunlight spilled through the curtains of my new room. It was luxurious, with every comfort carefully arranged. By him. Leo's care was in the details, from the soft pillows to the warmth of the fireplace that eased my sore muscles. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts.
Alpha Leo asked me to check in.
The cook said cheerfully.
What would you like for breakfast?
Surprise me, I called back, laughing softly. The cook's voice was cheerful as he left, but it wasn't just the physical strength I was gaining. I'd caught myself looking at him more than once, his broad shoulders, his hands steady as he guided me through training. It was hard to remember sometimes that he was just my mentor. I could feel my heart slowly becoming tied to Leo, the quiet intensity with which he cared for me. A part of me had already fallen for him, even though I knew it wasn't supposed to happen. He was older than me, 10 years if we're being honest, and he was still the alpha of the pack. I had no right to feel this way, but every time he looked at me, every time he spoke, I could feel something stir that I couldn't shake. I sighed, resting my forehead against the cold glass. It didn't help that every time I caught a glimpse of Caroline's eyes, narrowed and filled with jealousy, my chest tightened. She didn't say anything, but I could feel the rage simmering underneath her composed exterior whenever she watched me and Leo together. It made me uncomfortable. I felt like an intruder. I heard footsteps behind me and turned just as Leo stepped into the room. His presence was always so steady. like a rock I could lean on even when everything inside me felt like it was spinning.
Hey,
He said, his voice calm but warm.
how are you holding up?
I nodded. I'm good, I guess. Just thinking. His eyes softened, a faint smile playing on his lips.
About?
About everything, really, I said, pulling away from the window. It's a lot to take in, you know. I didn't expect all this. All of you. I realized the words had slipped out before I could stop them, but they were the truth. It wasn't just his strength that I found myself admiring. It was the way he made me feel safe, even when I felt so out of place. Leo's gaze was steady, his eyes studying me carefully.
I know it's been a lot, Meera, but you're doing well.
A soft knock interrupted the moment, and the cook popped his head in, holding a tray of food.
Breakfast is served.
He said with a grin. I smiled, feeling a little awkward, but thankful for the distraction. Thanks, I said, stepping toward the table. Leo stayed where he was, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. He was so comfortably there, like he belonged, like he had every right to be in my space. So, I said, taking a bite of the food and trying to distract myself from how close he was. How's everything with the pack? Leo's smile was small, almost like he knew I was trying to avoid the topic.
Everything's fine.
As I ate, Leo sat down across from me, still watching me, still waiting. But I didn't mind. With Leo, it felt like nothing needed to be said. Everything I needed was right here, in his quiet gaze and the way he cared for me. But the more time we spent together, the more I could feel it. The pull, the attraction, the bond. It wasn't just training anymore. The moonlight spilling through the window bathed the room in soft silver light. I was sitting on the bed looking out of the window again, like I always did. My fingers traced the cool glass as I stared out at the night, trying to focus on the sound of the wind rustling the leaves below, but my mind kept circling back to him, Leo, the man who had become my mentor, my anchor, my everything. And despite the voices in my head reminding me of the age difference, the reality of our worlds, I couldn't help the way my heart raced every time he stepped into the room.
Meera,
Leo's voice came from behind me, soft but filled with a weight I couldn't ignore. I turned to face him, a small smile pulling at my lips despite the storm inside me. His t-shirt clung to his broad chest in a casual way. He looked even more imposing now, the shadows of the room making him seem larger than life. His eyes were full of intensity, like he might just break if I said the wrong thing. He stepped closer, his presence making the space feel smaller, more intimate. He closed the distance between us slowly. I tried to push myself upright, but before I could, he did something that took me by surprise. He knelt. The sight of Leo, powerful, untouchable Leo, kneeling in front of me left me frozen. His hands rested lightly on my knees, his head tilted up, eyes piercing straight into mine, holding thousands of emotions, making it impossible to look away.
I know you're younger than me. I know this might not be what you expected, but I can't deny what I feel for you.
I froze, unable to breathe. My chest tightened, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at him.
I love you.
Leo confessed, his gaze unwavering.
And even if you don't feel the same, even if you don't accept my proposal, I'll still train you. You'll always be part of this pack.
My heart pounded in my chest, like it was trying to break free. But as much as I tried to hold myself together, I couldn't deny how Leo made me feel. He was everything I'd never realized I needed, everything I had been searching for. I met his eyes, my breath shaky. I can't say no to you. A soft smile spread across his face, but it was full of warmth, full of the care he'd shown me from the start. Without another word, he lifted his hand to cradle my face. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, his thumb brushing my cheek. His gaze dropped to my lips, just for a second, before coming back to meet mine. Without thinking, my hands lifted, cupping his cheeks, craving the warmth of him beneath my fingertips. His eyes locked onto mine, searching, asking silently for permission. When he leaned in, his height didn't quite match mine, and before I could even process what was happening, his strong hands gripped my waist, lifting me. A soft gasp escaped my lips when he set me gently on the edge of the desk, my legs instinctively parting just enough for him to step closer, his presence overwhelming in the best way possible. He stood between my knees, his hands resting on my hips, steadying me, his gaze never wavering. My breath hitched as his fingers brushed against my cheek, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear, with a tenderness that felt at odds with his rugged demeanor. His face was so close now, his lips just a whisper away from mine. He hesitated for a moment. Then, ever so softly, his lips brushed against mine. Feather-light, tentative, as if he feared one wrong move might shatter me completely. His hand slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer, a mix of restrained passion and unspoken need in the steady, commanding way he held me. My body responded to his touch instinctively. My fingers found their way to the nape of his neck, tangling in his hair as he tilted his head, deepening the kiss. His body pressed into mine, leaving no space between us. Then he pulled back, just a little, his gaze searching mine, silently asking if I was comfortable. When he saw the answer in my eyes, his fingers brushed against my shoulder, sliding the fabric of my t-shirt just enough to expose my skin, but not enough to make me uncomfortable. His lips followed, grazing softly along the curve of my neck, leaving a trail of warmth. Then, just as I felt myself melting into him, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I pulled back, my heart thundering in my chest. Across the room, Caroline stood, her eyes dark with something I couldn't quite read. Her stare was sharp, filled with jealousy and rage. Leo's eyes narrowed as he saw her, his jaw tightening.
Get out, Caroline. Now!
He said, his voice low but full of authority. Caroline didn't argue, but I saw the way she looked at me, like I had just stolen something she'd always thought was hers. Her lips curled in a hard smile before she turned and left, but not before giving me a glance that made my skin crawl. The door clicked shut behind her, but the tension in the room didn't fade. It only grew heavier, like I could feel the weight of her resentment pressing down on me.
I'm sorry, Meera. She's completely lost it.
He said, his voice filled with quiet frustration. I nodded, offering a small, understanding smile.
Sleep well, okay? Good night.
He added softly, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek. I didn't sleep well that night. My thoughts kept circling back to what had happened, what Leo had said, what Caroline had witnessed. The next morning I woke up to a heavy silence in the room. The sunlight was streaming in through the window, but it felt like something was off. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and then I saw her. Caroline. She was sitting at the foot of my bed, her arms crossed, staring at me with a cold fury that made me shiver.
I saw Leo struggling with you yesterday,
She said with a laugh, the sound edged with mockery, as if the memory itself was some private joke at my expense. I sat up in bed immediately, her words rattling through my thoughts. My pulse quickened as I tried to process the meaning behind them. But then her expression shifted, her laughter fading.
How dare you kiss Leo?
She snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. What? I stammered, trying to steady myself.
Just look at yourself.
She sneered.
So small, so fragile. And Leo, tall, broad, commanding. You don't match him in any way. Not in looks, not in strength, not in mind. There are plenty of women more beautiful and far better than you in our pack. You should stay away from him.
Her words hit like a slap, sharp and unforgiving, but I refused to let her see the sting. Instead, I stood taller, determined not to crumble under her gaze. I stood up quickly, my fists clenching. You don't get to tell me who I'm good enough for, I snapped. I'm not the one who's been sneaking around, watching things that aren't any of your business. Caroline's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't move. Instead, her voice was low, venomous.
Don't say a word to Leo. If you do, I'll finish you.
She stood up, her gaze still burning through me as she gave me one last warning look.
Stay out of my way.
I watched as she left, the door slamming shut behind her. But it didn't stop the ache in my chest. It didn't stop the fear that maybe she was right. I stood in front of the mirror, taking in my reflection. Small and fragile, it felt like I could break if the wind blew too hard, far from stunning. And Leo? He was everything. Handsome, commanding, authoritative. The kind of man who could silence a room with a single glance. Words echoed in my head. Maybe I didn't deserve Leo. But Leo hadn't said that. He hadn't let me go. A deep breath escaped me, and with it, the tears I'd been holding back. They streaked my cheeks, but somewhere in the midst of the pain, a flicker of resolve burned brighter. After that day, Caroline kept a close eye on me, watching every move I made, reminding me of her warning to stay away from Leo. I didn't want to, but I tried. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that keeping my distance would somehow make everything less complicated. But Leo didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. No matter how hard I tried to maintain that careful distance, he always found a way to close it. A casual touch on my arm, leaning in during a conversation, or catching my gaze with a look that made my heart stumble. All my efforts were wasted. It was one of those evenings when the air felt thick with something unspoken, like the world was waiting for a moment to shift. Leo and I were seated in my room, sharing a quiet dinner. The glow from the small lamp on my desk painted warm shadows on his face, softening his sharp features. He had dressed casually, dark jeans and a black sweater that hugged his broad shoulders. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms. It was ridiculous how a small detail like that could make my heart race. I stood beside Leo, but my mind kept drifting to Caroline's warning, pulling me back to reality even as my heart wanted to stay in the moment. Leo reached across the table to refill my glass of water, his fingers grazing mine for just a second. It wasn't deliberate, but it sent a ripple of awareness through me.
You've barely touched your food.
He said, his voice low and steady. I'm eating, I replied, shoving a forkful of pasta into my mouth to prove it. Leo smirked, leaning back in his chair.
If you say so.
I didn't miss the way his eyes lingered on me, as if I were the only thing in the room worth looking at. It made me feel utterly seen, yet terrified all at once. The sound of the door creaking open broke the moment. I turned to see Liam walking in. He hesitated in the doorway, his gaze flickering between us like he was trying to piece together a puzzle. He looked sharp as always, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, hair tousled just enough to seem unintentional. But there was something in his eyes tonight, rage and jealousy. Leo noticed him immediately and smiled, his tone as casual as ever.
How was the meeting?
Good.
Liam said, his voice clipped. Leo saw his gaze flickered to me, lingering for a moment too long. Leo instantly asked,
What happened, Liam? Are you okay?
Liam looked at me and then to Leo and said,
Yeah, I am okay. Good night, Leo.
His eyes flickered to me again for a briefest moment, and with that he turned and left. As soon as the door clicked shut, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Leo's gaze followed Liam's retreating figure, his brows furrowing slightly.
What happened to him?
He whispered, almost to himself. Then his expression shifted, more thoughtful, and he added,
You two are classmates, right?
I nodded, but the truth spilled out before I could stop it. I used to love him. Liam, I mean. My voice was softer than I intended, like I was confessing a secret I'd held too tightly for too long. For years I thought he was it for me, but he never really saw me, not the way I wanted him to. For a moment, he just stared at me, his smirk fading into something deeper. Then, without a word, He reached for my hand. His touch was warm and steady, his thumb tracing slow circles over my knuckles, grounding me in a way that no one else ever had.
Mera,
He said, his voice soft but firm.
the past is the past. It's completely fine.
His brown eyes met mine, full of quiet certainty.
I will always be there by your side.
A slow, disarming smile spread across his face, completely unaware of the tension brewing inside me.
Besides,
He added, his tone teasing.
he's too young for me, practically like a little brother. I might just tell him to start calling you sister-in-law from tomorrow.
The teasing glint in his eyes sent a rush of warmth through me, and I couldn't help but laugh. The sun was still low, just beginning to rise, and the world outside felt fresh, like it was waking up with me. Then, a knock at the door broke the silence. I thought it was Leo, ready to train me. But when I opened it, to my surprise, it was Liam standing there, looking a little too serious for this early in the morning.
Mera,
He started, his voice low but steady.
I was wondering if you'd let me train you today. I know Leo's been handling it, but I thought it might be good to mix things up.
I hesitated. The idea of training with Liam, when I was so used to Leo's presence, felt strange. But then, as I looked at Liam standing there, his expression earnest, I couldn't help but wonder if training with Liam might create some space between me and Leo, but even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Leo had a way of closing any gap I tried to put between us, whether it was physical or emotional. "All right," I said, my voice coming out softer than I intended. "I'll train with you." Liam's face lit up, though I could see a hint of something unspoken behind his eyes. But before I could think too much about it, I followed him outside, the chilly morning air brushing against my skin, reminding me that Christmas was just around the corner. I tried to focus on Liam, on the instructions he was giving me, but it wasn't enough to fill the void created by Leo's absence. Every movement felt incomplete, like I was missing something important. My mind kept wandering back to him, to the way his presence had a way of consuming the space around me. Even though I was here with Liam, training, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was pulling at me. I was catching my breath, hands on my knees. Suddenly I felt a presence. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. Sure enough, there he was, Leo, watching us from a distance, his eyes locked onto mine. He didn't say a word, but I could feel it, his jealousy. It was so palpable that it made the air around us feel heavier, more charged. Liam was trying to keep things light, cracking jokes here and there, but I couldn't stop thinking about Leo. Finally, after what felt like hours, Liam called it a day. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, still trying to shake off the weight of Leo's gaze. My muscles ached from the training, but it was the emotional tension that left me feeling drained. As I was walking back toward the house, I heard Leo's voice behind me, startling me a little.
Mera,
He called, his tone almost too calm, as if nothing had happened. He quickly closed the distance between us, standing just beside me in seconds.
you should take a break.
He said, his voice low and firm.
Tonight we're going out for Christmas party at the club.
His words were simple, but his eyes spoke volumes, filled with intensity, longing, and the urge to keep me by his side. Before I could respond the idea, Caroline's voice sliced through the moment like a blade.
"I'll come too,"
she said, striding toward us. I turned, and there she was. I didn't miss the way her eyes lingered at Leo.
Count me in.
Liam added, strolling back into the ground, his hands casually shoved into his pockets. His eyes flicked between me and Leo, lingering just a second too long on the space between us. There was a tension in his voice, subtle but unmistakable. Leo's gaze flickered from Caroline to Liam, then back to me. He let out a long sigh, rubbing his temple.
Listen,
He said, pointing at them like a frustrated parent.
this is a civilized place. Don't turn it into your personal battlefield. All right?
They both nodded, but the subtle glare Caroline threw Liam's way, It was like watching two alley cats sizing each other up before a fight. However, it was clear that both Caroline and Liam didn't want us to go alone. As the evening fell, I found myself pacing the room, debating endlessly. Should I go casual? No, that wouldn't fit for a club. But I didn't own anything remotely glamorous enough to match Leo's effortless sophistication. The thought left me frustrated, my fingers twisting the hem of my plain shirt. A soft knock at the door broke through my spiraling thoughts. I opened it hesitantly, and there he stood, a man dressed in the most eccentric outfit I'd ever seen. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of the movie named Pirates of the Caribbean, complete with a bandana and layers of mismatched, colorful fabrics. For a moment, I just stared, unsure whether to laugh or shut the door.
"Good evening, Mom,"
he said with a polite nod, his voice warm yet professional despite his theatrical outfit.
"I'm your stylist for tonight. What would you like to wear to complement the occasion?"
"Please, come in," I said, stepping aside. He entered gracefully, opening a sleek case to reveal a variety of stunning outfits. My fingers hovered uncertainly over the vibrant fabrics until my eyes fell on a navy blue satin off-shoulder gown. Its elegance seemed understated yet captivating. I hesitated, then finally picked it up, feeling the smooth fabric against my skin. "This one," I said, holding it up. The stylist nodded approvingly.
"Excellent choice."
Just as I was admiring the gown, Leo walked in, his presence filling the room like it always did. He glanced at the dress in my hands, then back at me. "I don't need all this," I said quickly, gesturing to the gowns and the stylist.
You do.
He replied simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. His gaze softened for a moment, and I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. Next came the hairstylist. He introduced himself with a quick handshake to Leo before turning to me.
"Let's try something elegant,"
he said, guiding me to sit in a chair in front of the mirror. I watched as he worked, his fingers quick and precise as he twisted my hair into a sleek bun, leaving a few loose strands to frame my face. The whole time, I could feel Leo's eyes on me. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. When the stylist was done, Leo whispered,
Mera,
a small smile tugging at his lips.
I'll get ready. The makeup artist should be here soon.
He said, then turned and walked out of the room. The makeup artist arrived next, her kit brimming with brushes and palettes.
Let's make you shine.
She said with a warm smile. She worked quickly, her hands gentle as she added soft touches of color to my face. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My skin seemed to glow, my eyes brighter and more defined. I turned my head slightly, taking it all in. "Wow," I murmured.
You look stunning.
She said, packing up her tools. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air kissed my skin, and I spotted Liam by the sleek black car. He was wiping it down, his jacket slung casually over one arm. He looked up, freezing for a moment when his eyes landed on me.
You look beautiful,
he said, his voice unusually soft. I smiled, feeling a faint warmth in my cheeks. "Thank you." Caroline appeared moments later in a vibrant red dress that clung to her like a second skin. Her hair was loose, cascading down her back in perfect waves. She gave me a fleeting glance, her eyes sharp before she tossed her hair over her shoulder and walked straight toward Liam.
"Liam, move to the back seat!"
she demanded, her tone sharp. Liam sighed, his voice dripping with irritation.
I'm already sitting here.
"Move!"
Caroline snapped.
You're so irritating.
Liam muttered under his breath. Caroline grinned triumphantly.
"Thanks! Now go back!"
Leo's voice interrupted, calm but with an edge.
None of you will sit in the front seat.
I turned to see him walking toward us, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The white shirt under his blazer fit him perfectly, the navy tying everything together. His hair had that wet, just-styled look that made him seem effortlessly handsome, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how good he looked. He stopped in front of me, his eyes briefly meeting mine.
Mera, sit in the front seat.
He said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Then he turned to Caroline.
You, backseat.
Caroline's smile faltered for a second before she composed herself and walked to the back. But I could sense the jealousy radiating off her. The club glowed with festive charm. Twinkling fairy lights hung from the ceiling, and a towering Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, adorned with ornaments and a bright star. The music pulsed through the room, a lively beat that kept the holiday spirit alive. A sprinkle of fake snow floated down, earning delighted cheers from the guests, their laughter blending seamlessly with the music. The air buzzed with warmth and joy, the essence of the season wrapping around everyone like a cozy embrace. As we walked through the entrance, I couldn't help but feel a little out of place. Of course, I felt pretty. But when Caroline strutted in wearing her red dress, bold, bright, and turning every head, it was like I faded into the background, hiding in the shadows.
So, what now?
He asked, breaking the silence as we entered the club. Leo, who had been quiet up until now, pulled me a little closer to his side.
Let's get drinks.
He suggested, his deep voice soft, just for me.
You deserve something strong after today.
I smiled at him, the warmth of his hand brushing against mine as he led me to the table. The way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the room, made everything feel so right. For a moment, I could forget about the tension, the training, even Caroline's gaze burning into my back. Liam and Caroline went off to get drinks, leaving Leo and me there. When they returned, drinks in hand, I could feel the tension in the air. They didn't seem thrilled about me sitting next to Leo. Caroline quickly masked her frustration with a smile.
Here.
She said, handing me my drink, but her gaze was sharp, burning with something I couldn't quite place. Leo seemed to notice it too, his eyes flicking between us, sensing the undercurrent of tension. He leaned back casually, one arm draped over the edge of the seat, his drink untouched in front of him.
Did you hear about the time Liam tried to convince the elders he could climb the tallest tree in the forest blindfolded?
Leo said, a mischievous grin tugging at his lips. I raised a brow, curious. What happened?
Come on, Leo. That was kids' play.
Liam cut in, his voice teasing but a little sharper than usual. Leo smirked, his eyes glinting with mischief, clearly unbothered.
He got stuck halfway up. Started yelling about an owl attacking him and had to be rescued. Took 3 people to get him down.
I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. It was the kind of ridiculous story that only Leo could tell with that much flair. Liam laughed too, but there was something about the way his eyes flickered to Leo and then back to me that made me pause. I guess I wasn't the only one who noticed how comfortable Leo made me feel. Without another word, Liam reached out, his hand landing firmly on my arm.
Mera,
He said, his voice low but insistent.
dance with me.
I glanced at Leo, who was still lounging in his chair. He gave a small nod, the kind of gesture that didn't give much away but felt like permission all the same. I hesitated for just a moment, then stood, letting Liam take my hand. As we made our way to the dance floor, I could feel Leo's gaze on me, sharp and unyielding, even from across the room. It was the kind of thing that made my heart skip a beat, though I didn't want to admit it to myself. As we stepped into the dance floor, Liam's hand settled on my waist. His other hand found mine, guiding me effortlessly into the sway of the beat, the rhythm of the music pulling us together. My eyes kept flicking back to Leo. He was leaning into his seat, one arm draped over the backrest, the other clutching his drink, watching us. He raised his glass, taking a long, deliberate gulp, his throat working as he swallowed. Without hesitation, he reached for another. Then another. I could see the way his grip on the glass tightened every time Liam pulled me closer. His gaze never wavered, intense and unrelenting, burning into me like a flame I couldn't escape. The heat of it reached me even across the crowded room, making my skin prickle with awareness. My step faltered, my rhythm breaking for just a moment.
Hey,
Liam murmured, steadying me with a firm squeeze to my waist. His grip was grounding, but it wasn't enough to pull me entirely away from the weight of Leo's stare. Caroline appeared at his side, sliding into the chair next to him, her movements smooth, practiced. She smiled, trying to get his attention. But Leo, he didn't seem to notice her at all. Not in the way she probably hoped. His focus was completely on me and Liam. Leo's stare was so heavy, like he was staking some kind of claim over the moment, over me. Liam followed my gaze, his lips pressing into a thin line.
Mera,
I blinked, pulling my focus back.
I wanted to tell you something.
He said, his grip on my waist tightening slightly.
Something important.
But I couldn't let go of the sight of Caroline and Leo. What's going on with them? I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Liam sighed, his shoulders slumping a little.
Caroline's always had a thing for power. She's wanted to be Luna since we were kids.
Does she love him? My chest tightened as I said the words, the question tasting bitter.
I think she does.
Liam said after a pause.
But it's complicated. Now listen to me, Mera, please.
Liam's voice broke, his hands trembling as he shook me gently, pulling my attention toward him. But before I could respond, my eyes caught something else. I saw Caroline lean into Leo. Her hand rested on his chest as she tilted her head, clearly aiming to kiss him. My heart thudded painfully, my grip on Liam's arm tightening. Leo jerked back, his hand swatting Caroline's away. His voice, though muffled by the distance, was sharp.
Don't you dare touch me like that again.
I didn't wait for Liam to react. I grabbed his arm, dragging him towards them. By the time we got there, Leo's eyes burning with rage, his expression thunderous. Caroline looked startled, her cheeks flushed, but she quickly composed herself. Leo turned to us, his gaze sweeping over me.
Party's over.
Leo said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He reached for my hand, his grip firm but unsteady. As he stood, his feet trembled, and I realized just how intoxicated he was. But he steadied himself almost immediately. He didn't say a word, just pulled me toward the exit. He called over his shoulder.
Are you coming, Liam?
Liam nodded, following us without a word. Once we reached the car, Leo slumped into the passenger seat, his head tipping back against the seat rest. His thigh brushed against mine. Liam slid into driver's seat. I saw Caroline rushing out, her heels clacking loudly on the pavement.
Leo, wait!
She called, her voice frantic.
She's still back there.
Liam said quietly.
She'll figure it out.
Leo replied flatly. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine. Leo, I whispered, meeting his gaze. His eyes were glassy, but there was a rawness in them that made my heart ache.
Yes.
He said, his lips curling into a faint smirk.
Keep looking at me like that.
I couldn't look away. My eyes clouded, my thoughts muddled by the intensity of him. He leaned, resting his head on my chest. The weight of him pressed heavily against me. My fingers moved instinctively, threading through his hair, seeking to offer him a quiet solace I wasn't sure I could put into words. His eyes stayed locked on me, unwavering, piercing. From the driver's seat, Liam watched us through the rearview mirror. His jaw was tight, his hands gripping the wheel just a little too hard. The tension in the car was suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to care. All that mattered was Leo. When we reached the fortress, Leo straightened slightly, his voice low as he told Liam,
Good night.
I walked with him to his room, his arms slung loosely over my shoulders. Once inside, he sank onto the edge of the bed, his shoulders hunched, his head dropping forward. I knelt in front of him without a word, my fingers working to untie his shoes. His hand caught my chin, tilting my face up until my eyes met his.
I didn't like the idea of you dancing with Liam.
He said, his voice rough, a confession more than a complaint. I asked you, I said softly. It was just a dance. He nodded slowly, his gaze not leaving mine.
Yes, I thought so. But I didn't like anyone touching you.
I didn't reply. My focus dropped back to his shoes, pulling them off one by one, then his socks. I slipped my fingers beneath the lapels of Leo's blazer, easing it off his broad shoulders with deliberate care before folding it neatly and placing it into his wardrobe. My hands hesitated for a moment, trembling slightly as they reached for the buttons of his shirt. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat a reminder of how close we were, but I forced myself to focus, unfastening each button with steady precision. As the fabric parted, revealing the sculpted lines of his chest, I couldn't help myself but admire. As I helped him change, I could feel his gaze following my every movement, heavy with a storm of emotions he couldn't put into words. It wasn't just a look. It was a silent plea, a confession, and a question all at once. I turned toward his wardrobe to pull out his nightclothes, but before I could reach them, his hand caught mine. His touch was firm, yet trembling. His eyes darker, like they held every unsaid emotion he'd been bottling up. I could feel the weight of his jealousy. It lingered in the space between us, impossible to ignore.
Wait here.
He said, his voice low and commanding. Before I could ask, he turned and walked out of the room. I stayed frozen in place. Moments later, he returned, holding a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth in one hand. His steps were deliberate but trembling, his gaze fixed on me as if he didn't trust me to stay still. He walked back to me, kneeling in front of the bed with a sense of purpose that made my chest tighten. He placed the bowl on the table beside me and looked up.
Sit down.
He said, his tone softer now, almost gentle. I sat. My pulse quickened as he leaned forward, his hand reaching for the strap of my gown. Sliding them down, but I didn't stop him. He dipped the cloth into the warm water, wringing it out before pressing it against my neck with careful precision. The warmth seeped into my skin, soothing and unnerving at the same time. Leo, I managed, my voice shaky. What are you doing? His eyes met mine, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, with a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, he said,
I'm cleaning his touch off you.
I froze at his words. The possessiveness in his voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't rough or cruel. It was raw, aching, as though this act was his way of claiming back a part of me he thought he'd lost. I didn't respond. What could I say to that? I just sat there, letting him work, his fingers trailing over my skin in slow, precise movements. His gaze dropped to my neck. He leaned in, his lips brushing softly against the skin he'd just cleaned. He tugged gently at the fabric of my gown, sliding it down to my waist, leaving me bare beneath his gaze. I expected to feel exposed, maybe even embarrassed, but his eyes held no trace of judgment, only reverence, as if he were seeing me for the very first time. The intensity in his stare sent warmth flooding through me, a slow flush creeping up my neck. His gaze swept over every inch of my exposed skin, lingering, reverent.
You're beautiful.
He murmured, his voice low and rough, meeting my eyes like the words were a sacred truth he couldn't hold back. But he didn't stop there. Gently, he turned me around, his touch firm yet careful, and pressed the warm cloth against my waist, right where Liam's hand had rested during the dance. The gesture was deliberate, possessive, and it left my breath caught in my throat. When he finished, his lips brushed softly against my waist, right where he had carefully wiped away the last traces of Liam. Then he stood up, leaning over me. His lips pressed firmly on mine, trailing a path down to the hollow of my throat. A shiver ran through me, and I felt the room tilt slightly, as though the ground beneath me wasn't quite steady anymore. I couldn't resist. I didn't want to. My lips moved on their own, pressing lingering kisses on his chest, tasting the faint saltiness there, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath my touch. My hands found their way down his chest, unbuttoning his pants. He groaned softly as I pressed my lips against his skin, each kiss a silent promise. Leo's hand tangled in my hair, his gaze searing as he looked down at me. His eyes darkened with something wild, something forbidden. He lifted me, positioning me above him, my knees on either side of his thighs. His hands rested firmly on my shoulders, steadying me.
Are you sure, Meera?
His voice hoarse. I nodded, my answer a kiss, desperate and trembling against his lips. A warm, knowing smile curved his mouth as his hands settled on my hips, pressing me down against him. The friction made my breath hitch, and I gripped his shoulders for balance, my head spinning from the intensity of it all. His eyes locked onto mine before his lips claimed me, pressing me harder against him. I was drowning in him, overwhelmed by the force of us. He was commanding, unmistakably, the alpha, my protector, my undoing, and somehow my salvation. I woke up to the warmth of Leo's body curled against mine. His arm was draped over my waist, heavy but comforting, and his even breathing tickled the back of my neck. For a moment I stayed still, savoring the quiet. The sunlight seeped through the curtains, painting the room in soft golden hues.
Good morning.
Leo's voice rumbled, rough with sleep, as his lips pressed a lingering kiss to my shoulder. Good morning, I whispered back, my voice barely audible. Before I could say anything else, he shifted, pulling me closer.
Come on, let's clean up.
He murmured, his voice carrying a mischievous undertone. I laughed softly, but before I could protest, he scooped me up effortlessly and carried me to the bathroom. The warm water cascaded over us as Leo gently washed me, his touch both tender and teasing. His fingers traced lazy circles on my skin, and every glance he gave me felt heavy with unspoken words. My cheeks flushed under his gaze. I reciprocated, gently cleaning him in return. As my hands moved over his skin, his eyes locked onto mine, steady and unyielding. I didn't look away, not even as I carefully tended to the very last inch of him, the moment stretching between us, intimate and unbroken. We stepped out of the bathroom, water droplets still clinging to our skin. His lips found mine again as he lifted me by my hips, pulling me against him like I was the only thing grounding him. I tangled my fingers in his damp hair, losing myself in the kiss until a flash of movement caught my eye. Caroline, I whispered, my voice low and uncertain. Leo's gaze followed mine, his jaw tightening for a brief moment before he exhaled slowly.
Face her,
He said firmly, his voice carrying just enough edge to ensure Caroline heard every word. His tone was calm but commanding.
You're the Luna now. Let her know that.
My heart pounded, but I nodded. Summoning every ounce of courage, I walked toward her. Caroline's expression was unreadable, her icy blue eyes scanning me from head to toe. What do you want? I asked, trying to sound calm, even though my stomach churned. A faint smile curved her lips.
Congratulations,
She said simply, her voice light but her eyes sharp. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I stood there, stunned, until Leo's hand found mine.
You handled that perfectly.
He said, his voice filled with pride. He guided me back to the bedroom, pulling out a stunning dress in deep emerald green. The fabric was soft, shimmering under the morning light. He slid it into my shoulder with precise care. As I started tying my hair into a loose braid, he stopped me, his fingers brushing mine.
Leave it down. I like it that way.
He murmured. Okay, I said, smiling.
Today,
He began, his tone shifting to something serious.
I've arranged a meeting to announce our marriage date.
What? I blinked at him, my surprise evident. Marriage? Leo? He cupped my face, his thumb brushing over my cheek.
It's time, Meera. Everyone will know that you're mine.
Before I could respond, he took my hand and led me down the long corridor to the meeting hall. My heart raced as we stepped inside, the room already filled with the pack. Conversations hushed as Leo's commanding presence took over. Standing beside him, I could feel the weight of every gaze. Leo's voice echoed confidently as he announced,
Meera and I are getting married soon. She is your Luna now.
There was a murmur of surprise, followed by scattered applause. The elders stepped forward, their expressions a mix of solemnity and warmth, to bestow their blessings upon us. I caught Liam and Caroline sharing a glance, their expressions unreadable but clearly displeased. Liam's eyes seared into me, a storm of desperation and frustration, as though I had shattered his trust. Leo squeezed my hand, grounding me in the moment.
By tomorrow, your room will be moved to mine.
Leo said, his voice soft. I nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. His touch reminded me that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Later that night, as I stood under the warm spray of the shower, I couldn't shake the memory of Liam's eyes, how they had looked at me, desperate and raw, as if I still belonged to him. I stepped out of the bathroom, wrapping a towel around myself, my skin still warm from the water when I froze. Liam was standing there, his figure casting a shadow that filled the doorway. His face was twisted in desperation, his eyes wild, filled with something dark and urgent.
Meera,
His voice cracked, breaking through the silence.
we need to talk.
His words were laced with pain, and before I could respond, he shut the door behind him, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. He crossed the distance between us in a heartbeat, gripping my arms and pinning me against the wall. His breath was shallow, his body pressed against me firmly.
I love you, Meera.
He whispered against my lips, his voice trembling with emotion.
I can't stand to see you with him.
His gaze dropped to my lips, burning with intensity. And then, before I had time to process, his lips crashed onto mine, desperate and angry, the kind of desperation that comes from holding something in for far too long. His kiss was all hunger and frustration, his lips pressing hard against mine like a storm, as if he was trying to force out every word he hadn't said in years.
I wanted to tell you everything at the party,
He said, his voice tinged with anger and hurt.
but you weren't listening. And now you are marrying him.
His actions pushing all my defenses down with a single forceful touch. Liam, stop, I said, gasping. I tried pushing him away, but he wasn't listening. Liam, I don't feel that way about you anymore. He stared at me for a moment, hurt flashing in his eyes, but he didn't stop. He quickly closed the distance again.
You don't mean that. I know you still care about me. I can feel it.
He whispered, his voice almost pleading. Before I could react, his hands wrapped around me, dragging me, placing me on the bed with an intensity that sent a shock through me. He leaned in, his fingers fumbling on my towel as if he couldn't get to me fast enough. His hands slid down, pulling the towel free, and his lips trailed to my neck and lower. His hands were fast and urgent, unbuttoning his shirt. The desperation in his movements made it clear. This wasn't just about what he wanted, but what he thought he'd lost. Each tug at his shirt, each frantic motion, sent a wave of unease through me. No, Liam, stop, I gasped, pushing weakly at his chest to gain some distance, but his grip was firm, unrelenting. His eyes, dark and full of need, locked onto every inch of my exposed skin. From the corner of my eye, I caught Caroline, her playful smile teasing the edges of her lips, her sharp eyes fixed on us with an unsettling intensity. It was as if she is enjoying my struggle. That knowing look on her face made it clear. She wanted this to happen. My heart pounding in my throat, but Liam's hands kept moving on my skin, desperate, frantic, and I felt a growing panic rise within me as I shoved him harder, finally breaking free. It's too late, Liam. I love Leo now. I confessed. The words hit him like a slap. He stood frozen, staring at me, confusion mixed with regret. He pulled back abruptly, his hands trembling, his face crumpled as if the weight of his actions had just hit him. Without a word, he wrapped the towel around me, his touch gentle now, his body stiff with regret. I watched as he crumbled, his head buried in his hands, as if he couldn't escape the reality I had just forced upon him.
I'm sorry,
He muttered, his breath shaky. He couldn't seem to find the words to explain the storm of emotions crashing through him. I didn't wait for him to say more. I grabbed the nearest towel and fled into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear myself think. As I stood there, staring at my reflection in the fogged-up mirror, I heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating, then silence. As soon as Liam's footsteps faded, I stepped out of the bathroom, my chest still tight with frustration. Caroline stood there, tall and composed, her arms crossed over her chest like she'd been waiting for this exact moment.
So?
She said, her voice laced with mock innocence, but the smirk on her lips betrayed her true intentions.
Having an affair with the alpha and beta at the same time? Impressive.
I shot her a glare. Didn't you see me push him? I spat, the anger in my voice barely masking the simmering panic beneath. Caroline tilted her head, her smirk deepening. She didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her words cut like a blade.
Liam is handsome and he loves you, but you want to be with Leo instead. Is it because you love him, or is it the allure of his power that draws you in?
Don't, Caroline, I warned, my voice low and trembling with restraint. She ignored me entirely, taking a step closer, her tone almost playful.
Just thinking,
she said with a shrug.
How Leo might react when he hears about this special moment with Liam.
Her words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in silk, her gaze pinning me in place. That smirk on her face was maddening, like she already knew how this would play out and was simply enjoying the spectacle. And then, with a casual flip of her hair, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my fists clenched, my mind racing what to do next. I rushed through the hallway, my heart pounding against my ribcage. The words were just on the tip of my tongue. Leo needed to hear them from me. He had to know the truth. But the closer I got to his room, the more the tension in my chest tightened. As I reached the doorway, I stopped dead in my tracks. Caroline was there, standing too close to Leo. Her voice was low, comforting, almost too soothing. And Leo, his face was buried in his hands, his posture slumped as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. My stomach twisted. I stood there, frozen, watching her. I could feel my blood boiling, a mix of frustration and anger bubbling up inside me. Caroline was saying something. I could hear the words now.
And Mera, she kissed Liam like he was her whole world.
I stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath my weight, breaking the tension. His head snapped up, his hazel eyes filled with hurt and jealousy, but mostly disbelief.
Mera,
he said, his voice hoarse, but there was no warmth in it, only something darker.
is it true, what Caroline said, that Liam kissed you?
I felt my heart shatter in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself from answering. Leo, please, it's not like that. I can explain.
Explain? Is it true or not?
He shouted, his voice raw with anger, venom lacing every word. Yes, he was desperate, Leo. I started, my voice trembling, but the words caught in my throat as he cut me off sharply.
That's impossible.
His voice rose, anger and disbelief mingling.
He played in my lap as a child. I know his every instinct.
His tone was firm, almost daring me to contradict him.
He can't do this. You're lying.
Frustration radiated off him in waves as he stood abruptly, the screech of the chair against the floor cutting through the air like a blade. In an instant, he was in front of me. Then he took a slow step back, his eyes sweeping me from top to bottom. Shame flushed my face, and I tugged my clothes tighter around me. But his look, that mix of anger and pain, it sent my heart spiraling into panic. His hand came up to my cheek, his grip firm, almost painful as he lifted my face. I had no choice but to meet his eyes, which burned with a mix of anger and betrayal.
You should have told me earlier, Mera, that you loved Liam. We could have been friends. I trusted you.
His voice cracked, but it was the rage beneath it that stung more than anything. Leo, that's not true. I care about you, I love you. But as I said it, I felt it slip away, The harshness in his gaze only deepened, and I knew that Caroline's words had already taken root, twisted everything I had tried to explain. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair in frustration.
You've been playing me. All this time. I don't know if you ever cared about me, or if it was just about power, about using me.
His words felt like a slap, sharp and stinging. It's not like that, Leo. I tried to explain, reaching out, but he took a step back.
You don't get it, do you? You wanted me. You wanted everything I could give you, but not my heart. You were never real with me.
His words tumbled out, raw and desperate.
I can't do this anymore.
His head fell back into his hands, and I knew I had lost him. It was over, no matter what I said or did. The weight of his words pressed down on me, suffocating me, making me feel smaller, like a shadow in the room where once I had felt seen. My hands trembled at my sides, and I took a step back, the room spinning as the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier. I can't stay here, I whispered, barely hearing my own words. I reached the door. Leo's voice stopped me.
You don't have to leave the pack, stay.
I turned slowly, looking at him. There was pain in his eyes, real pain. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But just then my gaze fell on Caroline. Her hands were on Leo's shoulder, soothing him in a comforting way. A victorious smile tugged at her lips as she met my gaze. She had won. The cold night air hit my skin as I stepped out of the fortress, the weight of my decision pressing against my chest. The stars above twinkled faintly, but they felt distant, like they belonged to a world I no longer had a place in. My hand gripped the strap of my bag tightly, fingers trembling as I forced myself to take the first step away from everything I'd ever known. But then, a hand grabbed mine, firm and warm, stopping me in my tracks. I turned sharply. It was Leo. His eyes met mine, steady but burning on me as if he was holding back a flood of emotions. Just behind him stood Liam, his face tense and unreadable.
You can't leave,
Leo said, his voice low but steady, almost pleading. I tried to pull my hand away, but his grip tightened. Leo, let me go, I whispered, the ache in my throat threatening to break into tears. He shook his head, stepping closer.
It's not safe for you out there, you know that.
Safe? I let out a bitter laugh, my voice trembling. What part of staying here has been safe for me, Leo? You think I'll be safer staying where I'm unwanted? His eyes softened for a moment, the edges of his anger melting into something almost vulnerable.
It's not that simple, Mera. Stay. I won't bother you.
I don't need your mercy, I spatted, yanking my hand free, taking a step back. Before Leo could speak, Liam, who had been silent until now, stepped forward.
Mera, wait.
He said, his voice uneven. His hands were buried in his pockets, his gaze shifting between me and Leo. His face was pale. He looked different, desperate. I don't want to hear it, Liam, I snapped, my voice sharp, though my heart felt like it was breaking all over again. He reached out, his expression raw.
Mera, please just listen to me.
I don't want to listen, I interrupted, taking another step back. Liam's shoulders slumped, his hands falling to his sides. For a second I thought I saw regret flash across his face, but I couldn't let myself care. I turned away from both of them and walked into the night. The first few weeks on my own were hell. My wolf instincts fought me every step of the way. Without Leo, the bond we shared, no matter how fragile, felt like a gaping wound. Nights were the worst. The silence pressed in on me, and I'd find myself reaching out for someone who wasn't there. I found a small cabin at the edge of the woods. It wasn't much. A single room with creaky floors and a leaky roof. My stomach growled in protest, the hunger gnawing at my insides. I knew I had to find food soon. Leo's words echoed in my mind, steady and firm.
At first, wolves should hunt small animals. Don't go after the big ones. They're dangerous. A rabbit is one of the best choices. Quick, plentiful, and safe.
The memory of him standing beside me in the woods, his gaze steady and sure, grounded me. I could almost hear his voice again, like a guide, reminding me to be patient, to trust myself. I wasn't hunting for sport, but for survival. I needed to feed myself. With a sharp breath, I crouched down, trying to stay silent, my body moving in time with the forest. The hunger in my stomach pushed me forward, urging me to focus. I scanned the underbrush, waiting. A rustle of leaves caught my attention. There, just ahead, a rabbit nibbling on the ground. My heart raced, and I stilled, eyes narrowing in concentration. Leo's words hummed in my thoughts.
Small, quick, safe.
I had to make this count. Quietly, I edged closer, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The rabbit never saw me coming. In one swift motion, I lunged forward, my hands closing around the animal. It struggled for a moment, but I held on, my breath steady despite the adrenaline that coursed through my veins. I had done it. I had followed Leo's voice, and it had worked. My body ached in ways I hadn't known it could, but as the weeks passed, I began to feel something I hadn't in a long time: strength. I was making it, slowly, painfully, but I was making it. One evening, as rain poured down in relentless sheets, a knock echoed through the quiet. My heart jumped into my throat. No one knew I was here, or at least no one was supposed to. I opened the door cautiously, and there he was. Liam. His broad and tall frame wet from rain, hair dripping down his forehead, and his soaked shirt clung to his frame, leaving little to the imagination. His eyes dark and stormy, water sliding down the sharp angles of his face. His eyes met mine, and I could see it. The apology, the regret, the hurt. He looked worn, tired, like he'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice flat, though my pulse quickened. He hesitated, his hands fidgeting as if he didn't know what to do with them.
I came to see you and also to apologize.
His voice was quiet, almost unsure. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Apologize for what, Liam? For trying to ruin my life?" He flinched at my words, his eyes dropping to the ground.
I didn't know.
He said softly.
That day, when Leo announced your marriage with him, I lost it. I was desperate. I wanted to confess my love that I had been buried inside me for years. But Caroline, she fueled it. She told me you still loved me. That if I just acted, you'd forget about him.
My chest tightened, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "What?"
Yes,
he admitted.
I thought I could fix things between us. But Caroline, she said things about you and Leo. She said you two hadn't gone too far, and that if I acted, I will get you back, and I believed her. I am sorry.
Liam's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping for a moment as if he was wrestling with words he didn't want to admit. There was something raw in the way his shoulders tensed, jealousy flickering across his face before he exhaled sharply. Then his sea-green eyes met mine, locking me in place as he stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but the weight behind it was undeniable.
And Leo, he's not okay.
He said, his tone edged with frustration.
He's different since you left. He had started visiting to the club every night and comes back intoxicated. The calm composure he always had, it's cracking. Meera, he's falling apart without you. The pack sees it. He is angry, all the time. He shouts at the pack members, snaps at them for the smallest things. He's always frustrated, but he won't talk about it. He's trying to bury everything.
The pain in his voice was unmistakable, jealousy buried beneath his concern. I could feel the ache in my chest growing stronger with each word. I wanted to ask if Leo still cared, if he was feeling the same pull toward me that I was feeling toward him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. "What are you saying, Liam?" I asked instead, crossing my arm, pretending not to believe him.
He's pulling away from the pack, from everything. And Caroline, she's trying to get closer to Leo. She wants him. I can see it in her eyes. She's pushing, Meera. And with you gone, she's trying to take your place.
"Let her, I don't care," I said, my voice firm. Liam nodded slowly, his expression impossible to read.
I needed to say I'm sorry. For everything.
Before I could respond, he stepped closer, wrapping his arms around me in a hug that was surprisingly gentle, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure I'd accept it. His warmth lingered, the embrace carrying a quiet sincerity that tugged at something deep inside me. Then he pulled back just enough to press a soft kiss to my forehead.
Please, take care of yourself.
He murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, he turned and walked away. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire and the rhythmic scrape of my knife against the carrot in my hand. The wind outside howled through the trees, shaking the window panes. But inside, the little room was warm and comforting. But then the door slammed open, and the chill of the night rushed in. Caroline. I froze, knife still poised mid-slice. Her silhouette filled the doorway, her hair wild, her eyes blazing with fury. She stepped inside, slamming the door behind her with so much force that the walls seemed to shudder.
You've ruined everything.
She spat, her voice trembling with rage. I dropped the knife. My first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin was tiny, just 4 walls and a single exit. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice shaking as I took a cautious step back. Caroline's laugh was bitter, sharp like broken glass.
Don't play dumb, Mera. You've taken everything from me. Leo was supposed to be mine. Mine. But then you had to come along with your sad little eyes and helpless act.
Her words hit me like slaps, but I forced myself to stay calm. Caroline, you don't understand.
Oh, I understand perfectly,
she interrupted, taking a step closer. Her movements were jerky, like she was barely holding herself together. Her green coat was splattered with mud, and her boots left a trail of wet footprints on the wooden floor.
You think he loves you? That he'll forgive you? You're nothing but a distraction to him. A weak, pathetic distraction.
I swallowed hard, my eyes darting around the room for anything I could use to defend myself. The knife was on the counter, out of reach now. I didn't ask for any of this, Caroline, I said quietly. Her face twisted with contempt, her lips curling into a sneer.
Liar!
Before I could react, she lunged. Her weight slammed into me, knocking me back against the table. The edge bit into my spine, and I cried out as we both tumbled to the floor. She was stronger than I expected, her hands clawing at my arms, her nails digging into my skin. "Stop it! Please, Caroline!" I shouted, trying to push her off, but she pinned me down, her face inches from mine. Her breath was hot and ragged, her eyes wild with hatred.
You don't deserve him!
She screamed, her voice cracking.
You weak little women!
I twisted beneath her, my wolf instinct screaming at me to fight back, but I couldn't shift. I didn't know how to channel the strength I could feel bubbling just beneath the surface. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, raising it high above her head. My heart stopped. This was it, my end. I shut my eyes, helpless and trembling, bracing for the blow. But before she could bring it down, a presence yanked her away from me.
Caroline, enough.
Leo's voice was a roar, filling the tiny cabin like a thunderclap. His presence was overwhelming. His broad shoulders slouched slightly as he leaned against the doorway, the moonlight outlining his disheveled frame. His shirt hung loose, the top buttons undone, revealing the hard planes of his chest. The faint scent of alcohol clung to him, heavy and suffocating, mingling with the warmth of his skin. His steps were uneven, and the intoxication only fueling the storm simmering inside him. In an instant, he crossed the room and ripped her off me, throwing her against the wall.
Are you out of your mind?
He snarled, his voice shaking with barely restrained rage. His chest heaved and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Caroline crumpled to the floor, her expression shifting from fury to panic.
Leo,
Don't even try to explain this.
He growled, cutting her off. I struggled to sit up, my body aching from the scuffle. Leo's eyes flicked to me, and for a moment, his anger softened, replaced by something raw and vulnerable.
Meera,
He said, his voice breaking. He was by my side in an instant, his hands hovering over me like he wasn't sure where to touch me or not.
are you okay?
I nodded, though tears streamed down my face. I'm fine, I whispered, even though I wasn't. His jaw tightened as he turned back to Caroline, who was still on the floor shaking.
You could have finished her.
He said, his voice low and dangerous.
Leo, please.
She stammered, her bravado crumbling.
No,
His voice was cold and rough.
you're coming back with me. You're going to answer for what you've done.
He immediately called Liam.
Liam, you need to come here and take Meera to the fortress. I am taking Caroline to imprison her.
I sighed, listening to Leo's words. He hauled her to her feet, his grip unrelenting. His eyes flickered to me for a moment.
Meera, I will be back in minutes.
His voice rough. And then he dragged her out of the cabin without another word. Whole body ached, my hands trembling as I stared blankly at the door. The footsteps outside grew louder, and then Liam appeared, his face pale with worry.
Meera,
He breathed, rushing to me, his eyes scanning my bruised arms and tear-streaked face.
I'm so sorry. I should have stopped it.
His voice cracked as he reached out, his fingers brushing gently over the cut on my arm, his touch warm and careful. It's okay, Liam, I whispered, though it wasn't. Not really. My voice sounded hollow, and I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. Before he could say more, the door creaked open again. Leo stood there, his presence filling the room instantly. His eyes darkened when he saw Liam's hand on my arm, and something unreadable flickered across his face. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, none of us spoke, the tension sharp and crackling like a storm about to break. But he stood in front of me, his eyes inspecting my wounds.
I should have been here sooner.
He murmured, his voice thick with guilt. It's not your fault, I said. He shook his head, his eyes glistening.
Yes, it is. I am so sorry.
The night was quiet, except for the faint sound of our footsteps crunching over the gravel path. The cold air nipped at my skin, the moonlight stretching long shadows across the fortress grounds. My arm brushed against Liam's as he walked beside me. I wasn't steady. The shock of what had just happened still buzzed through my veins like static.
Careful.
Liam murmured. His hand immediately came up to my shoulder to steady me as I stumbled on a loose rock. I steadied myself, muttering a soft, "Thanks," but my eyes darted to Leo ahead of us. He didn't look back, but I felt the tension rolling off him in waves. His broad shoulders were stiff, his steps deliberate. His hands trembled at his sides, as if he were holding back from turning around. His silence was loud, louder than any words he could have spoken. As soon as we reached the fortress, I made my way to my room. When I entered the room, it was exactly as Leo had redesigned it. Everything was in its place, clean, warm, and inviting, as if time had stood still and I had never left the fortress. I peeled off my jacket, wincing as the fabric caught on a scrape along my arm. The bathroom mirror reflected a mess, tangled hair, smudged makeup, and a mix of dried blood and dirt on my skin. I grabbed a clean towel and a basin of water, sitting by the edge of the bed as I dabbed at the cuts. The sting made my breath hitch, but I worked quickly, trying to focus on the task rather than the ache. My clothes were a lost cause, stained beyond saving. I pulled them off, wrapping the towel around myself before standing to gather something fresh to wear. Just as I reached for a clean shirt, the door creaked open. I froze. The air seemed to thicken, my pulse hammering in my ears. Slowly, I turned, clutching the towel tighter around myself. It was Leo. He stood there, his hand still on the doorframe, his chest rising and falling like he'd run a marathon. His eyes, half opened, darted to me for the briefest second before falling to the floor.
Sorry.
He said, his voice low and rough, but there was something in his tone, something cold, distant.
I didn't know.
Leo, wait! I took a step forward, desperate to explain. Before I could say a word, his voice sliced through the silence.
I just came to warn you. Stay away from me, Meera.
His voice cracked, betraying the storm underneath, but his stance remained rigid, unyielding. His gaze stayed glued to the floor, as though looking at me was too much. His hands flexed at his sides, saying these words. The words hit like a slap, leaving me breathless. Before I could find the right thing to say, he turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a heavy finality. I stood there, the towel still wrapped around me, my heart sinking under the weight of his misunderstanding. The air in the room felt colder now, emptier, like it had carried him with it when he left. A soft knock pulled me out of my thoughts.
Meera, please open up. Alpha Leo sent me to tend to your wounds.
Reluctantly, I opened the door and sat on the edge of the bed, silent as the maid carefully cleaned the gashes on my body and wrapped them in fresh bandages. Her touch was gentle, but her words cut deeper than any wound.
Leo's not the same, Meera,
She'd said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking it aloud would make it worse.
He's been drinking every night since you left. The elders are losing faith in him. They're already talking about making Liam the alpha.
The Leo I knew, the one who commanded a room with just a look, who stood taller and prouder than anyone else, was falling apart. I made a decision. No matter how hard it would be, I was going to help him find his way back to who he used to be. The version of him that wasn't weighed down by pain or regret. The one I glimpsed in his rare, unguarded moments. It wouldn't be easy, but I owed him that much. As night crept in, I paced my room, my thoughts swirling like a storm. I couldn't sit back and watch this happen. Not to him. It was just past midnight when I heard his heavy footsteps in the hallway. My heart pounded as I opened the door, stepping out just as he reached the entrance. He was already halfway to the door, his car keys jingling in his hand. "Leo," I called softly, but he didn't stop. I hurried forward, stepping in front of him just as he reached for the handle. "Please, Leo, don't go." He froze, his hand hovering mid-air, but he didn't look at me. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were shadowed, unreadable.
Move, Meera.
I shook my head, my hands trembling but firm at my sides. "Not until you listen to me." His eyes snapped to mine then, sharp and blazing.
I said move.
"Leo, please don't go." My voice broke. Before I could finish, he stepped forward, his hands gripping my shoulders as he pushed me out of the way. I stumbled, my feet slipping on the cold stone floor. My chest hit the wall, and for a moment I couldn't breathe.
Meera!
Liam's voice cut through the air, and suddenly he was there, his arms steadying me as I tried to regain my footing.
What are you doing, Leo?
Liam snapped, his voice filled with something between anger and disbelief. Leo didn't answer. His eyes flicked to us for a split second, just long enough for me to see the torment buried beneath his anger, before he crossed us, stepping inside the car.
I respected you like an elder brother, Leo.
Liam spatted from behind, his voice sharp with anger as he leaned over me, helping me off the ground. His hands were firm but careful, a mix of frustration and concern etched across his face.
But now you're getting worse day by day.
The sound of his car starting echoed in the still night. I watched from the doorway, tears streaming down my face as the taillights disappeared into the darkness.
He's changed.
Liam said softly, his hand lingering on my arm, steadying me as though I might collapse at any moment. His voice was laced with sorrow, his eyes searching mine for something. An answer, maybe hope.
I'm sorry, Meera. He's lost himself.
Before I could respond, his fingers brushed gently against the cut on my cheek, his touch light but deliberate. He carried me inside the fortress, my heart aching in ways I didn't think were possible. Leo, I knew, was slipping further and further away, and I didn't know if I could pull him back in time. The clock ticked softly in the quiet room. Midnight had come and gone, but I was still waiting, sitting by the window. My hands were clenched in my lap, the soft fabric of my dress bunching between my fingers. He wasn't coming home. And then I heard it, the low hum of an engine, cutting through the stillness. My heart leapt, hope sparking for just a moment before the sound of shuffling footsteps and grunts broke through the night. I pushed myself off the chair, rushing to the door. My heart twisted as I watched him. Leo stumbled in, his legs barely holding him up as the driver half-dragged him inside. His head lolled forward and his clothes hung loose on his broad frame. His hair was disheveled, dark strands falling into his eyes. "Leo," I whispered, stepping forward. He didn't look at me. As he brushed past me, his steps were heavy, uneven. I reached out, my hand barely grazing his arm. "Leo, wait."
Don't.
His voice was hoarse, sharp. He pulled his arm away as if my touch burned him, and I staggered back, the rejection stinging more than I wanted to admit. But I didn't give up. I followed him down the hall, my bare feet patting softly against the cold stone floor. The driver helped him to his room, laying him on the bed with a tired sigh. He gave me a small nod as if to say, "He's out," before leaving us alone. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Leo lay sprawled across the mattress, his long legs hanging awkwardly off the edge. His shirt was wrinkled, one sleeve rolled up, and his boots were still on, streaked with dirt. I stood in the doorway, my chest tightening. He looked so defeated. This wasn't the Leo I knew. Quietly, I stepped closer, kneeling by the bed. His breathing was slow, his lips slightly parted. I reached for his boots, tugging at the laces, and his body stirred.
Leave me, Meera.
He murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion.
Just go.
I froze, my hands trembling, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I gently pulled off his boots, setting them aside. He turned his head slightly, his eyes fluttering open for a brief moment before closing again.
Why are you pretending to care?
He whispered, the words barely audible. They cut through me like a blade. My throat tightened, but I didn't respond. I didn't know how. I slid my arms under his shoulders, lifting him just enough to sit him up. His head lolled forward, resting heavily against my chest. His body was warm, his weight pressing down on me as I worked to unbutton his shirt. Every movement was slow, careful, as if I might break him. I peeled the fabric away, revealing the sharp angles of his shoulders and the rise and fall of his chest. He murmured something incoherent before sinking back into the mattress. I grabbed his nightdress from the drawer, slipping it over his head with careful hands. When I was done, I tucked the blanket around him, smoothing it over his chest. I couldn't help myself. My fingers brushed gently against his jaw, as if the simple touch could somehow bridge the gap between us. Slowly, I pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, lingering for just a moment, hoping he'd feel the weight of everything I couldn't say. The quiet tension hung in the air, heavy with unspoken words. I sank to the floor beside the bed, my knees pulled to my chest. My gaze lingered on his face, the slight furrow in his brow, the curve of his lips. "Why can't you let me help you?" I whispered, knowing he couldn't hear me. The room was quiet except for his steady breathing. I leaned my head against the side of the bed, exhaustion washing over me. Before I knew it, sleep pulled me under. The sound of Leo's voice startled me awake. It wasn't loud, but it carried that sharp, cold edge that sliced straight through the fog of sleep.
What are you doing here?
I blinked a few times, trying to adjust to the sunlight spilling in from the hallway. My heart raced as I looked up at him. He stood tall, his posture rigid, chin tilted high. His hair was a mess, sticking up in every direction, and his jaw was clenched tight enough to cut glass. "I was just helping," I stammered, pushing myself up from the floor. My back ached from sleeping there, but that didn't matter at the moment. His lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw clenched at his sides. Without another word, he grabbed my arm, not too hard, but firm enough to make his point, and pulled me toward the door.
I don't need your help, do you get it?
His voice was low, almost a growl. I didn't argue. What would be the point? So I let him lead me out of the room, his fingers slipping away from my arm as soon as I crossed the threshold. He didn't look back. The days that followed blurred into a routine I couldn't seem to break. Every night, he'd try to leave for the club, and every night, I'd stand in his way. At first, Leo would shove past me, his hands rough and his frustration rolling off him in waves. Liam would step in, standing beside me, yelling at Leo in a futile attempt to break through his anger. It never worked. Afterward, Liam would sigh, mutter an apology, and gently carry me inside. He'd offer his shoulder for me to lean on, let me cry until my tears ran dry. His care was steady, unwavering, but no matter how much comfort he gave, it never stopped the ache in my chest that throbbed endlessly for Leo. But then, something shifted in Leo's behavior. He stopped pushing. Instead, his arms would stay stiff and unyielding as he stepped around me, carefully avoiding eye contact, his silence heavier than any words he could have said. It was a strange kind of victory, one that left me feeling more defeated than triumphant. When he came home late, his steps unsteady, I was there to help him. He usually yelled, telling me to stay with Liam instead of waiting for him. But tonight was different. He didn't fight. He just stood there, swaying slightly, letting me pull his shirt off, his eyes half closed. The tension between us was unbearable. His gaze burned into mine, his chest rising and falling like he was fighting to keep something caged inside. And then, without warning, he stood up. I barely had time to take a step back before he closed the distance between us. My back hit the wall and I froze. He stumbled upon me firmly. His hands found my arms, holding me in place. His breathing was heavy, warm against my skin, and I shivered when I felt the barest graze of his lips against my neck. It wasn't a kiss, not really, just a whisper of touch that sent every nerve in my body into chaos.
You have no idea what I can do to you.
He murmured, his voice low and raw, each word heavy as if he'd been suppressing them for far too long. My breath hitched. I couldn't move, couldn't think, only feel. The heat of his hands seared through me, the weight of his body pressed against mine, igniting a longing I could no longer contain. The warmth of his touch, the one I had yearned for, sent shivers down my spine. The tension between us crackled, a storm teetering on the edge of breaking. Without thinking, my hands rose, cupping his face gently. "Leo," I whispered, my voice trembling. But then, just as suddenly as he'd closed the space between us, he pulled back. His hands fell away, leaving my arms cold and aching for the heat of his touch. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't place, as he stepped away, putting an agonizing distance between us.
Don't come here, Meera,
he growled, his voice low and ragged, teetering on the edge of desperation. His eyes flickered with a storm of emotions he couldn't hide.
I might do or say something I can't take back. Leave. Now.
It wasn't a request. It was an order. But his eyes said all his story. He was fighting hard to bury his feelings for me. I didn't argue. My heart was pounding too hard, my mind too clouded to think straight. I turned and ran, my bare feet hitting the cold floor as I stumbled toward my room. Once inside, I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as I gasped for air. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the blanket from the bed and wrapped it around myself, like it could somehow shield me from what had just happened, but sleep wouldn't come. Minutes later, I was back at his door. I didn't even remember deciding to go. My body moved on its own, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. The room was quiet. He was asleep on the bed, his face softened in rest, free from the torment that seemed to follow him when he was awake. I sank to the floor by the bed, pulling my knees to my chest as I stared at him. His hair was messy, falling across his forehead, and his lips were slightly parted. He looked so different like this, so vulnerable. My chest ached as I watched him. How far had we drifted from each other? And yet, here I was, unable to stay away, even when he told me to. I reached out, my hand hovering inches from his. I didn't dare touch him, but my fingers trembled with the want of it. The morning sunlight slipped through the curtains. As I blinked awake slowly, the ache in my chest familiar now, like an old wound that refused to heal. The sound of running water caught my attention. I turned my head, still half asleep, and there he was. Leo. His hair was damp. A towel sat low on his hips, clinging just below his navel as he came out of the bathroom. He didn't say a word, didn't even look my way. I watched him. His jaw was set, his movements precise, almost mechanical, like he was doing everything in his power to ignore my presence. I sighed and dragged myself up, my body heavy with exhaustion. My own room felt colder than usual when I returned, the silence pressing in on me. Later that afternoon, Liam showed up at my door. His presence was steady, a comfort I didn't know I needed until he was there.
Tonight is my Alpha Oath Day,
He said, his voice carrying a weight, clearly displeased by the decision of the elders. I couldn't help the smile that tugged at my lips, even as I sensed the tension in his words. I'm happy for you, Liam. You deserve it. He shook his head, his expression darkening.
I don't, Meera. Not really. Leo deserves it more than me.
I didn't know what to say, so I just watched him. He looked exhausted. The same bone-deep weariness I felt creeping into every corner of my body. We had tried everything to bring Leo back, but the seed Caroline had planted in him was rooted too deep. He didn't trust me, not even Liam. The silence in the room felt suffocating, stretching between us until Liam finally met my gaze. His eyes softened in that way they always did, like he could see every fracture I tried so hard to hide.
You've done enough, Meera.
He said gently, his voice carrying a weight that made my chest ache.
Leo's not coming back. Not the way you or I want him to.
His gaze shifted to the window, the light catching the flicker of pain and anger in his expression.
The pack members, they're talking. Rumors are spreading, Meera. They're saying you're nothing but a toy for him, something he can use and toss aside.
The words stung more than I cared to admit, but I forced my voice to stay steady. Let them say what they want, Liam, I replied, keeping my tone sharp even as the cracks in my resolve threatened to show. I don't care. But the truth lingered between us, unspoken. Maybe I didn't care what they said, but I cared about Leo, about the pieces of us that were slipping further and further away. Liam's voice broke the silence again.
Will you come to the ceremony?
Yes, I said quietly, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to face everyone. Liam had been there for me, listening when I cried, offering me a shoulder when I felt like I was drowning. He didn't deserve my hesitation. By evening, I was dressed and ready, though my nerves felt like they were tied in knots. But the whispers started almost as soon as I arrived.
Isn't she the one sneaking into Leo's room at night?
I heard he doesn't even care about her.
She's nothing more than a toy to him.
I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep walking. My dress, a soft blue that matched the evening sky, suddenly felt too tight, too revealing under their judgmental gazes. Liam found me, a warm smile spreading across his lips.
You came. Thank you.
Out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of Leo. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable, but I felt his eyes on us. He approached Liam, congratulating him, but I didn't dare to move toward him. The ceremony was beautiful, grand, and alive with energy. Liam's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his stance, a flicker of unease crossing his face, but he straightened his shoulders and steadied himself as he faced everyone. When he began to speak, his voice was calm and resolute, carrying the weight of every promise he was about to make. I clapped along with everyone else, genuinely happy for him. As the ceremony ended and the night deepened, I saw Leo slipping out of the fortress, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows. I hurried after him, my steps quick and quiet until I caught up with him by the gates. Liam followed me. "Where are you going?" I demanded, stepping in front of him. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing.
Move, Meera.
No. The word burst out of me, fueled by weeks of frustration and heartbreak. You've lost everything, Leo. Your position as alpha, the respect of your people, everything. His eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't say a word. And you're just running away again, I continued, my voice breaking. You've lost everything, and yet I'm still here. Why can't you see that? Before he could respond, a wave of dizziness hit me. The world spun, my knees buckling beneath me.
Meera,
His voice was sharp, panicked as he caught me before I hit the ground. The last thing I saw was his face hovering over mine, his expression full of worry, and then everything went dark. When my eyes fluttered open, it took me a moment to make sense of the shapes around me. There they were. Leo, sitting in the corner, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it had all the answers. His dark hair was messy, falling over his forehead, and his jaw was clenched tight, like he was holding back words he'd regret. Liam was by the window, his arms crossed, looking out at the gray clouds swirling outside. His shirt was untucked, and he looked tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with sleep, but the kind that sits heavy on your chest, like carrying something too big for too long. The doctor stood behind me, clipboard in hand, her expression carefully neutral. She glanced at me, then at them, her lips pressed in a thin line like she didn't want to be the bearer of whatever news she was about to deliver.
Mera,
She said, her tone professional but kind.
you're pregnant.
A strange heat rised to my cheeks. My hand instinctively went to my stomach, though it was far too early for anything to feel different. I looked at Leo, my heart pounding. This could change everything. Maybe this baby could bring him back to me, back to us. But his reaction was not what I expected. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, towering over everyone in the room. His face twisted into something I couldn't recognize, a mix of disbelief and fury.
congratulations.
He said, his voice laced with venom. His eyes darted to Liam, then back to me.
Guess you two have a lot to celebrate.
What are you talking about?
Liam shot back, standing straight. His voice had an edge, but his expression stayed calm.
This is your child, Leo. You know that.
Leo, you're being ridiculous. Stop it, I yelled, my hands shaking as I pushed myself up on the bed.
No, let him finish.
Liam said, his tone sharper now.
Go ahead, Leo. Say whatever it is you think you know.
Leo let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. His dark curls fell into his face, but he didn't bother pushing them back.
I don't need to think.
Leo spat, his eyes boring into Liam.
You've been hovering over her like a damn shadow, Liam. Always there, always helping. And now I'm supposed to believe this isn't your child.
His words were laced with bitterness, but there was something else beneath them. Hurt, anger, maybe even fear. Liam stepped forward, his hands balled into fists at his sides. His frustration radiated off him in waves, his green eyes blazing as he stared at Leo.
Yes, Leonardo.
He said, his voice rising.
Because you've been treating her like garbage. That's why.
Oh, really?
Leo's laugh was sharp, humorless.
And I suppose you're just playing the saint, right? Tell me, Liam, can you honestly say you don't love her? That nothing happened between the two of you the day I announced my marriage to her?
The room went so quiet I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Liam took a step closer to Leo, his expression darkening.
You didn't see that with your own eyes, did you?
Liam said, his voice trembling with anger.
For once, you could have tried to understand the truth. But no, you'd rather let Caroline, and all people, fill your head with lies.
Liam wasn't done.
Yes, I love her. I went into Mira's room that night.
He said, his voice cracking.
I wanted to fix things between us. But Caroline saw me struggling and fueled my desperation. She told me, no, she begged me to claim Mera, to ruin what you two had. And you know what Mera did, Leo?
Liam's voice dropped, and he turned to me, his eyes softening.
She pushed me away.
He said quietly.
She stopped me. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Because you were too busy doubting her to ask.
Leo froze at his words. The wall he had been building between us cracked just for a moment. I felt my stomach twist, my heart pounding in my chest. My anger bubbled up, hot and fierce. "Let him think what he wants," I said, turning to Liam. Then I shifted my gaze back to Leo. "If it's easier for him to lie to himself, then fine. But tell me something, Leo. Did you even try to find out the truth? Did you think for 1 second that maybe, just maybe, I deserved the benefit of the doubt? No, you didn't. Did you once think, hey, maybe Meera isn't the villain in my little fantasy? No! You were too busy doubting me, too busy ruining yourself." Leo opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His hands fell to his sides, his fingers twitching like he wanted to reach for something but didn't know what. "Now, when you've rejected your own child, denied them as yours, I give up on you, Leonardo," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Liam stepped closer to me, his voice low but full of emotion.
Mera,
He said, his green eyes locked on mine.
marry me. I'll take care of you and the baby. How long are you going to keep chasing after someone who doesn't even see you?
The words hung in the air like a challenge, cutting through the tension like a knife. Leo flinched, just barely, but I caught it. His expression cracked for a moment, something raw flashing in his eyes before he turned away. He didn't look back as he walked out of the room, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. The silence he left behind was deafening. Liam knelt beside me, his hand warm and steady on mine.
I'm serious, Mera.
He said. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of vulnerability he couldn't quite hide.
You deserve someone who will love you and this child, someone who will show up for you.
I stared at him, my heart a mess of anger, longing, and something I couldn't quite name. The room felt too small, the walls closing in as I tried to make sense of everything. Leo's anger, Liam's steady presence, the child growing inside me. I took a deep breath. "Liam," I began, my voice soft but firm. "You don't understand. Marrying you would be wrong. It would be cheating you out of the love you deserve." His steps faltered and he turned to face me, his jaw tightening.
How can it be wrong, Mera? I love you. I've always loved you. Doesn't that count for something?
I shook my head, tears threatening to spill over. "It does. It counts for everything. But my heart, it belonged to him." His face fell, and I saw the way his shoulders sagged like the fight had gone out of him all at once.
Leo.
He said quietly. It wasn't a question. I nodded, the ache in my chest growing sharper. No matter how he treats me, no matter how broken our relationship is, my heart is his, and I can't change that, Liam. Liam let out a shaky breath, his eyes searching mine.
What about the child?
He asked, his voice cracking.
A child needs a father, Mera. How do you plan to do this alone?
I'll take care of the child, I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. I'll protect them, raise them. But I can't marry you, Liam. It wouldn't be fair, to you or to me. He closed his eyes for a moment, his hands trembling at his sides. When he opened them again, they were glistening with unshed tears.
Mera,
he said, stepping closer, his voice almost a whisper.
I would do anything for you. You know that, don't you? Even if it means watching you love someone else.
My heart twisted painfully. I reached out, my hand brushing his arm. I know. And that's why you deserve better than this. Better than me. I'm leaving, I said, my voice trembling but determined. But I won't go until I clear my name, until everyone knows the truth about what actually happened. I won't leave with these accusations hanging over me. Liam nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine.
I understand. But Mera?
He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around me in a tight hug. His warmth enveloped me, and for a moment I let myself lean into him, feeling the strength of his love, the steady beat of his heart.
I love you,
he said softly, his lips close to my ear.
I've loved you since the moment you loved me. But I never told you, because you were human and I was not.
I pulled back just enough to look up at him, confused. He offered a small, sad smile but didn't elaborate.
I have to leave for a while.
He continued.
There's some important business I need to take care of. But when I come back, I'll make things right. I'll bring Caroline out of the prison and confront her in front of everyone. She won't get away with this, Meera. I promise.
Tears slid down my cheeks as I nodded. He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead, lingering for just a moment before stepping back.
Take care of yourself,
he said, his voice thick with emotion. Then he turned and walked out the door. Leo owned my heart, but Liam's love had left an ache that I wasn't sure would ever fade. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the faint moonlight creeping through the heavy curtains. It painted silvery lines across the stone floor, and for a moment, I let myself imagine a life where the weight of this place didn't sit so heavily on my chest. Then I heard them, Leo's footsteps, soft, deliberate. Each step echoed in the hallway like a countdown, sharp and steady. My breath hitched. I knew where he was going. Every instinct screamed at me to stop him, to rush out, block the door, beg him not to leave. But instead I pressed my palms against my ears, hard enough that my arms trembled. Don't listen, I whispered to myself. Don't you dare. I squeezed my eyes shut and leaned back, forcing my body to relax. He didn't need me to stop him, and if I did, what would that even mean? That I cared? That after everything, I was still weak enough to chase after him? No, I wouldn't do that, not anymore. The muffled sound of his steps faded, and the ache in my chest dulled slightly. Slowly, exhaustion pulled me under, and I slept. When I woke, the first thing I noticed was the warmth. Not from the blankets, but from something, or someone close. My eyes fluttered open and my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Leo. He was there, on the floor, his head resting on the edge of the bed. His dark hair was a mess, and there was a softness to his face, and, for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. What are you doing here? My voice came out sharper than I intended, but the sight of him this close, this vulnerable, had me completely off balance. He stirred, lifting his head slowly. His eyes locked onto mine. For a second, he didn't say anything, just stretched like a lazy cat before sitting back on his heels.
You didn't stop me,
he said, his tone calm, almost accusing. I frowned, crossing my arms over my chest. Stop you from what?
from leaving last night. You always stop me.
He said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world.
But you didn't. I came back to ask why. You were asleep, though, so I stayed.
You stayed? I repeated, incredulous. On my floor? You couldn't just leave? He didn't argue, as if he had already expected my reaction. Without saying a word, he turned and walked away. The nights had grown strangely silent. Since that day, Leo's footsteps no longer echoed through the quiet hallways. He stopped visiting the club, stopped running from the mess he'd made. Instead, he seemed determined to become the Leo he used to be, the one who was calm, composed, and commanded respect without saying a word. With Liam gone, Leo had stepped up, immersing himself in the pack's affairs like a man with something to prove. The reckless edge that had once shadowed his every move was replaced by a sharp focus. Day by day, he began to rebuild himself, handling responsibilities with the authority that once came so naturally to him. There were moments when I'd catch a glimpse of him through the window, speaking to pack members or reviewing reports with an intensity that hadn't been there before. He was steady now, deliberate, as if he was determined to repair the cracks he'd let form, not just in the pack, but in himself. He was pouring all his effort into becoming the Leo I had always admired, but that calm, authoritative demeanor he showed the world seemed to crumble in front of me. Every morning as I opened my eyes, I found him there sitting on the floor, just beside my bed. His back leaned casually against the frame as if it was his place to be. And every time, like clockwork, I shoved him away, sometimes with words, sometimes with glares sharp enough to cut. Leo, stop this, I'd say. but he never argued. He'd only leave quietly, as if my rejection was what he expected. Tonight was different. I woke in the middle of the night, a dull ache spreading across my lower back. The room was dark, the faint amber glow of the bedside lantern casting long shadows on the walls. I shifted in bed, trying to stretch the pain away, but it didn't help. Then I noticed him. Leo was already standing, as if he had been watching and waiting for the smallest sign of discomfort. His silhouette was tall and steady, outlined by the dim light.
What's wrong?
His voice was low, tinged with concern. Nothing, I said quickly, pulling the blanket higher, suddenly self-conscious.
Meera,
He pressed, his tone firmer this time.
what is it?
I hesitated, biting the inside of my cheek before muttering, "My back hurts." That's all. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the wardrobe, opened it with a quiet familiarity that made my stomach knot, and pulled out a small jar of pain relief balm. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended.
Helping.
He said simply, as if the answer was obvious. Before I could protest, he moved to stand behind me, his fingers brushing against my shoulder as he gently tugged at the back chain of my nightgown. The cool air kissed my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. "Leo," I whispered, unsure if it was a plea for him to stop or something else entirely.
Relax, Meera. You've been under too much pressure these past weeks. Because of me. Let me take care of you now.
He murmured, his breath warm against my neck. His hands were steady as he applied the balm, the cool sensation of the ointment quickly replaced by the warmth of his fingers. His touch was slow, deliberate, lingering. Each movement sent tiny ripples of awareness through me, a quiet intimacy settling between us like a fragile thread waiting to snap. My breathing hitched. I hated how my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch even as my mind screamed to pull away. When he finished, his hands didn't immediately leave me. Instead, they slid up to rest on my shoulders, firm yet gentle. Slowly, he turned me to face him, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my pulse race. Before I could respond, his lips were on mine. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was desperate, hungry. His tongue slid into my mouth, claiming me, and for a brief moment I let myself drown in the heat of him. His hands moved to cradle my face, his thumbs brushing against my jawline. I could feel his presence everywhere, his breath mingling with mine, and for that fleeting second, I let go. I felt his passion, his longing, the way he tried to say everything he couldn't with words. But reality hit me like a cold wave. "Stop," I whispered. My trembling hands pressed against his chest, creating just enough distance between us. He stepped back, his breathing uneven, his eyes locking onto mine. Pain and longing flickered across his face, a storm he was barely keeping in check.
I am sorry, Meera. I couldn't stop myself.
His voice rough with emotions. "I am not your toy," I said, my voice shaky but resolute. "Don't ever treat me like that again." For a moment, he froze, his shoulders tensing as if my words had sunk deep, twisting like a blade.
Toy?
He said, his voice low and hoarse.
You were never my toy, Meera.
"Yes, I am. That's what everyone is saying, Leo, that I'm just some thing for you to use." My voice cracked, his expression shattered, a raw desperation taking over his features.
No, Meera. I never thought that. Not once.
He swallowed hard, his voice breaking.
I've always loved you.
"Love me, really?" My voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. "If you loved me, where was your love when you pushed me every time I tried to stop you?" He staggered as if my words physically hit him, his hands clenched at his sides, his breathing ragged.
Every time I saw you, it burned me. I couldn't stand it. The thought of Liam touching you.
He admitted, his voice trembling.
Meera, I wasn't myself, and I hated what it turned me into. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
"You never trusted me, Leo." Never, and this doesn't fix anything that we had lost. He took a step toward me, his hand reaching out as if to touch me, but I stepped back, my arms wrapping around myself like a shield. He raised his hands in surrender, his voice soft, almost pleading.
All right, all right. I'll leave right now. But please don't get upset. It's not good for our baby.
My hands clenching at my sides. Your baby? A few days ago, you rejected this baby, remember? It's not your baby, Leonardo. Get that through your head. Now leave. The words spilled out of my mouth before I could stop it. A shadow of pain crossing his face, his eyes silently begging for forgiveness. He didn't argue, his shoulders sagging in defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The leather couch under me was warm from the fading sunlight streaming through the fortress windows. It was quiet, the kind of stillness that stretched time and made you second-guess everything. Then I heard a low rumble, hum of a car engine. I stood and moved toward the window. A sleek black car rolled to a stop just outside the iron gates. Liam. When I stepped outside, the chill of the evening air wrapped around me. Liam climbed out of the car, his tall frame commanding attention. He was dressed in black like Leo's, his suit perfectly tailored, but it was his expression that caught me. That rare, genuine smile that softened his sharp features.
Mera,
He said as he walked toward me. His voice was steady, warm, like he'd been waiting to see me all day.
today I'll keep my promise to you.
I didn't ask which promise. I knew. The one he made when this nightmare began, to clear my name. Liam's presence commanded the room as he turned to the guards by the gate, his voice cutting through the air like steel.
Gather the pack, immediately.
He ordered. His eyes flicked to a nearby servant, a cold smile playing on his lips.
Find Leo. Ask him to join.
His tone dropped, sharp and unforgiving.
And bring her out. Now.
Caroline. My chest tightened at the thought of her. I wanted to see her face when the truth came out, but I wasn't sure I was ready for the flood of emotions that would come with it. Liam glanced at me again, his eyes softening for just a second.
Stay close,
He said.
I want everyone to see who you are.
Minutes later, the courtyard was alive with the murmurs of the pack. Everyone had gathered. Even Leo was here. He stood near the edge of the crowd, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his leather jacket, his jaw clenched. His eyes flicked toward me for a moment, but I quickly looked away. Liam took his seat on the Alpha's throne, a symbol of power and responsibility. He gestured for me to sit beside him on the smaller chair to his right. My breath caught, but I forced myself to move, to take the seat as the weight of the pack's stares settled on me. The guards dragged Caroline into the courtyard. Her once perfect blonde hair was a tangled mess, and her eyes, which used to sparkle with confidence, were dull now, filled with something like fear, or maybe anger.
Caroline,
Liam's voice cut through the chatter, silencing the crowd.
do you know why you're here?
Caroline laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that sent a chill down my spine.
Spare me the theatrics, Liam.
She spat.
Just get on with whatever this is.
Liam leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees.
This isn't a game, Caroline. You've lied, manipulated, and betrayed this pack. It's time for everyone to hear the truth. From you.
For a moment, Caroline said nothing. Her gaze swept over the crowd, then landed on me. Her lips curled into a bitter smile.
You want the truth?
She said, her voice dripping with mockery.
Fine. I'll give it to you.
She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling.
It all started the moment Mera walked into the pack with her helpless, innocent face. And Leo, he was drawn to her like a magnet, but all my patience broke when Leo announced his marriage to her. I couldn't stand it, the thought of him, of anyone, choosing her over me. So I did what I had to do.
I felt Liam tense beside me, his fists clenching on the armrests of his chair.
I went to Liam,
Caroline continued, her tone sharp now.
Who was already desperate to fix things between him and Mera. I took the advantage of it. I made him think That Meera still loves him, and he just needs to claim her.
She smirked, her eyes narrowing at me.
I even made sure Leo thought the same about you and Liam. Every whispered lie, every seed of doubt. I planted them all.
The words hit like daggers. I clenched my fists in my lap, my nails digging into my palms. Caroline's gaze shifted to Leo.
I did it for you,
She said, her voice softening.
Everything I did, because I love you.
Leo stepped forward then, his movements stiff and deliberate. His face was hard, unreadable, but his voice cracked as he spoke.
No, Caroline.
He said quietly.
You didn't do this because you love me. You did it because you love power. If you loved me, you wouldn't have destroyed everything I cared about.
Her face crumpled for the first time. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. His voice cracked, heavy with guilt.
Because of you, I made Meera suffer in ways you can't imagine. If you had been in her place, you'd have run long ago, away from everything. That's why I chose her over you, because she deserves me. She deserves to be the Luna. More than you, more than anyone else.
Liam stood then, his presence commanding as he addressed the pack.
Caroline's actions have not only endangered Meera, but the stability of this pack. She has betrayed us all.
His voice was steady, but the anger simmered beneath it.
She is no longer welcome here.
The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces a mix of anger and relief.
Take her to the border.
Liam ordered the guards.
She is to be deported immediately.
Caroline struggled as the guards dragged her away, her desperate cries echoing into the night. Her figure vanished into the shadows of the trees, and the pack stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the spot where she disappeared. Liam stepped forward, his voice steady but thick with emotion. He turned to the gathered crowd and said something that sent a shiver down my spine.
I've heard of how well Leo has managed the pack in my absence.
He said, his gaze shifting to Leo, who stood in the crowd.
And now, I'd like to transfer my position as Alpha to Leo.
The crowd erupted. I could barely catch my breath through the clapping and the cheers. The tension in the room was palpable, the kind you could almost taste in the air. Leo, who had been lost for so long, was finally back. And just like that, he was taking his place. Liam stretched out his arms to hug Leo, his face softer than I'd ever seen. I couldn't even speak. My chest tightened, and for a split second I thought I might crumble right there. Leo clasped his hands in front of Liam, his head bowed.
I'm sorry, little brother.
Liam stood still for a moment, his gaze intense, searching. And then, he shook his head with a shaky breath. He said,
No, you don't need to apologize. Please, take your throne. You deserve it more than anyone. Elder brother.
The room erupted in cheers. But when Leo's eyes found mine, I felt a rush of emotions, happiness and sadness intertwined, swirling together in a way I couldn't quite explain. There was a heaviness in his gaze, an emotion I hadn't seen in months, something that felt like a distant memory, now brought to life. I stood there beside him, frozen, my feet rooted to the ground as if the weight of the moment had somehow pulled me in deeper. The crown on his head suited him for what he had always been, the leader, the protector, the alpha. It wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a part of him. He looked every bit the king he was meant to be, but in that moment, he wasn't just Leo, the alpha. He was Leo, the man I once knew. Leo stood before the crowd, holding my hand tightly. I tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. He met my eyes, his voice steady and resolute.
Meera was never a toy for me.
He confessed.
I love her, and I am announcing my marriage to her, if she agrees.
The room fell into stunned silence. The whispers that had surrounded me, the cruel words spoken behind my back, faded into the background as the eyes of the crowd shifted toward me. Some of them looked away, while others, I could see, bore an unspoken apology in their gazes. Later that night, I stood at my room, packing my things. The soft rustle of the fabric and the sound of my breathing were the only things breaking the silence. My hands moved automatically, folding clothes and placing them into my bag, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. My thoughts were tangled with Leo, the baby, and all the unspoken things I had been carrying for so long. Liam was by the door watching me, his expression unreadable.
You're leaving?
He asked, his voice soft. The sadness in it made my chest ache. I have to, I replied quietly, not looking at him. I didn't want to see the hurt in his eyes. I didn't want to feel it either. Liam stepped closer, his hand brushing against my shoulder as if to steady me.
Please, Mera, stay, at least until the baby is born. Don't leave now.
I paused, the words hanging in the air. I felt a wave of tenderness wash over me, but I couldn't stay. Not anymore. I can't. I need to go, I said, swallowing hard. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled me into a hug, the kind that told me everything he couldn't say. His lips brushed against mine for the briefest moment, just a whisper of a kiss, as if it wasn't right. His eyes were intense, holding back his emotions.
I'll miss you,
he murmured against my lips. Thank you for everything, Liam. I don't know what I would have done without you by my side, I whispered, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek, a gesture for all he had done for me. Tears streamed down his face, and I gently wiped them away. You'll find the love of your life, I said softly, my voice trembling. Someone better, someone who can give you everything I couldn't. He shook his head, his eyes glistening.
I don't want anyone else,
he murmured before pressing his lips to mine. I couldn't stop myself. In that fleeting moment, I gave him the tenderness he had always longed for. I poured into that kiss every ounce of care and respect I had for him now. A silent acknowledgement of everything he meant to me. As we pulled back, Liam wordlessly took my bag and walked beside me, his steps heavy with unspoken emotions. I glanced over my shoulder at the fortress, the place that had both broken and rebuilt me, where I'd found my strength under Leo's guidance. The memories were a storm, swirling and relentless. Just as I was about to step into the car, a hand gripped my arm, firm and desperate, pulling me back.
Mera.
It was Leo, his voice full of regret. He looked different somehow, humbled, vulnerable. I almost didn't recognize him as the man who had once doubted me. Leave me, Leo, I whispered.
No. I can't. Please.
He said, his voice low.
I'm sorry, Mera. For everything. For doubting you. For everything I did to hurt you.
His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I tried to pull away, but then, before I could take another step, Leo dropped to his knees, his hands clasped around my legs, his grip desperate, his tears soaking into the fabric of my dress. I looked down at him, the king, the dominant, authoritative man who could silence an entire hall with just one look, now falling at my feet, crying like a child, consumed by the fear of losing me. To see him so vulnerable, so broken, was more than I could bear. Despite the hurt, despite the weight of everything that had happened, I saw his sincerity. I saw that he was truly sorry. I reached out, my hands moving instinctively to his shoulder, lifting him up. He rose slowly, his eyes meeting mine, and I gently touched his face, my fingers brushing away the tear that had slipped down his cheek. I can't forget what you did, I whispered, my voice breaking. But I see you. I see the man you've become. I forgive you, Leo, but I can't stay. I can't keep living like this.
No. I can't survive without you, Mera. I will die without you and our baby.
He whispered, cupping my face. And in that moment, I saw it. The man I once loved, the man who had broken me, now vulnerable and broken in front of me. The pain, the guilt, it all poured out of him in a way that was so raw, so real. I closed my eyes, my own tears slipping down my cheeks. My heart ached. I wanted to walk away, to stay angry, but deep down, I knew I couldn't. Okay, I whispered, the words feeling like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. His eyes widened, surprise and relief flickering across his face. Without hesitation, he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. He leaned down, but as always, my height didn't match his. With a swift motion, he lifted me by my hips, pulling me closer. Then, his lips met mine, soft but urgent, as if he was reclaiming something he'd lost for far too long. The kiss was everything I hadn't known I needed, intense, full of longing and a promise of something more. Behind me, I could feel Liam's presence. He was watching, but instead of anger or jealousy, I saw the softest smile, a smile of acceptance on his face, like he was happy to see us both finally at peace.